50 years ago, this crusty old Chevrolet was racing at Harriman Dragstrip, and now it's tucked away in a warehouse in downtown Chattanooga, Tennessee. And in this video, we're showing you the history of this old school gasser. Since I grew up around hot rods and drag cars, I got to see a lot of cool stuff when I was a kid. And one of the cars I got to see was this 55 Chevrolet, and it was stashed away in a garage in Pikeville, Tennessee. And I knew that it was an old race car, but I didn't really know a whole lot about it. But I recently got the chance to see this car again, and I wanted to show it to you guys here and then trace back the steps to show you this car's history dating all the way back to the 1960s. A guy by the name of Paul Ault owns this car now, and he's had it for lots of years, decades even. And he actually got this thing from Denny George. And as you've seen, if you've seen the video about Denny George's collection, if you haven't, I encourage you to go look at that now. But he had this car in the woods with some of his other cars. And while it was sitting there in the woods, Paul Ault always showed interest in that particular car. And eventually, Denny just gave it to him. And at the time, Paul was just 16 years old. Denny gave him this thing as his very first project car. So when I visited this warehouse in Chattanooga, my intention was just to make a few laps around the car, shoot some detail stuff, and get a better understanding of some of those small things that I may not have noticed 20 plus years ago the first time I saw this car. One of the guys who knows the most about this car is one of my dad's best buddies, Tommy Dillard. Now, he was a drag racer in the 60s and 70s, and he was around this car when it was in action. He said that this car was owned and raced by Tommy Clayton from right here in Ray County, Tennessee. But he shared some earlier memories, and it became pretty clear that this was not Tommy Clayton's first drag car. In fact, he actually started drag racing with a 1941 Ford. Eventually, the drag racing hobby sort of took over like it always does, and Tommy Clayton built a 55 Chevrolet to go drag racing with. This one was going to run in the D-gas category, and he had put together a 301 cubic inch small block Chevrolet for it. And in this car's original configuration seen here, he actually ran a 3-speed transmission instead of the more popular 4-speed. So this original 55 Chevrolet met its demise at Harriman Dragstrip. It had a pretty major clutch explosion which absolutely ruined a lot of things, including the brake lines, which caused him to lose control and ended up running it off the end of the track. He took what was left of that car and put it into another 55 Chevrolet, this time a Bel Air. Still the same two-door sedan body style, but this one had a little bit more trim, a little bit more fancy stuff, but it still made for a really good race car, and he didn't mind one bit cutting those quarter panels out for the rear tire clearance and doing the same routine as far as getting rid of the bumpers, getting rid of the headlights, the tail lights, anything that was not necessary, he got rid of it. The car was still running a 301 cubic inch engine, still running in the D-gas category, but now with this new setup, he was running a 4-speed transmission. As you'll see in these pictures, this car had a name, most of them did back in the day. It was called the Phantom. And I'll help you be able to decipher some of the other lettering on this car because you may not be able to see it in these pictures. But above the driver's door, you'll see Tommy and Freddie. And an interesting tie back into my own personal history, Freddie, that's actually Freddie Best, who is a previous owner of my 1964 Corvette. As it turns out, he was interested in drag racing back in the day and was partners with Tommy Clayton on this car. Other things you'll see on this car as far as the lettering is concerned is Luke's Body Shop. That was a local body shop here in Ray County. And on the quarter panels, it's lettered Dayton Boat Dock and Restaurant, which is actually a pretty famous place these days. Bass fishing has become extremely popular here in Dayton, Tennessee. And the boat dock's still in business, the restaurant's still in business. So it's kind of cool to see it lettered on this car from the late 60s. You can also see the bright red roll bar. You can see right through the window. You can see that there's a tack mounted to the dash. You can see that hood scoop, which is just made out of a piece of tin. You can see it's just bent over and probably screwed or pop riveted to that hood. You can also see the fender well headers coming down. It's got chrome reverse wheels on it. You'll notice that the car still has most of its Bel Air trim all the way around the windows. The quarter panel trim, of course, it got butchered for tire clearance. And in every picture I've seen of the car, it does not have trim on the front fenders. One of the coolest things about this car is that they didn't use a trailer or a ramp truck or anything like that to haul this car to the racetracks. They actually flat towed it. And there's still some evidence of this inside the car. When we look inside, we see the floor pan, and it's really rusty. There's lots of holes, lots of ventilation in here. But when we look back here at the back of the drive shaft tunnel, we can see a hole that's been cut out. The purpose of that hole was so that they could have quick access to the U-joint back there. They would actually unbolt the drive shaft from the rear end and just let it hang while they flat towed this car. Well, that sounds like a bad idea because it would just be hitting the ground. And their solution for that, which is still on this car, it's amazing that this survived all these years, but there's a little chain underneath that's connected to the frame. This little chain would hold the drive shaft up so it wouldn't drag on the ground. As we look inside of the 55, we can also see the remnants of a roll bar. You can see where it was welded onto the frame rail, and you can kind of see where they had cut the floorboard out around it, even though there's a lot of rust in this floorboard nowadays. You can't see it now because Paul has fixed this firewall. He's actually recessed it back a couple inches for engine clearance, and he has made it a little more factory than the way they had it. It was a little bit more butchered back in the day, but it had a trap door in the firewall where Tommy could open that little trap door and adjust the ignition timing from the driver's seat. He could actually reach in there. It had a magneto on it, and he could actually turn that magneto to advance or retard the timing. And I just think that kind of stuff is always really cool when there's little tricks like that that these guys used to do. So one thing I didn't know on this car was its history after it was the Phantom, because this car changed towards the end of its drag racing career, and we see some remnants of that when we walk around this car today. We see that it had a brown paint job on it, which is a little odd for a race car, and it had some yellow hand lettering still remaining on the quarter panel. And my first phone call when I left the shop was to my dad, because if anybody was going to know anything about this, he was going to know. So when I asked him about this 55 Chevrolet that I believe to be Tommy Clayton's car, but I don't understand why it was brown, I always thought this car was blue, he explained that the car got repainted brown. This was at some point in the early 70s. And he said that he even remembered his dad, my Pawpaw, hand lettering this car. And actually on the door it said Tommy's Toy. So it was no longer called the Phantom, it was Tommy's Toy. And it had Hickman Automotive on the quarter panel. That was the sponsor. But you'll see on the bottom of this quarter panel, and this is my favorite thing about this car, is that some of that lettering still remains, and it says Daisy, Tennessee on there. So really cool piece of history right there that helps us document this car 100% and confirm that it is Tommy Clayton's old 55 Chevrolet D-gas car. So this car ended up racing into the early 70s, and that was sort of the end of racing at Harriman Dragstrip. You know, they moved on to different hobbies, and his old 55 didn't have much of a purpose anymore. So Tommy Dillard and little Tommy Clayton, Tommy's son, they actually pulled the motor out of the 55 and they put it over in Tommy Dillard's 57 Chevrolet station wagon. So, you know, this motor went to a good home, and they ended up running, I think, modified production with that station wagon. But the end was near for this 55 race car. And this thing was just a used up, cut up old race car, and it didn't mean anything to hardly anybody. But Denny George ended up with this car. He put it out in his woods. He was just going to use it for parts or whatever. And he decided instead of letting it just sit there and rot away, he was going to give it to a young guy who was just crazy about cars. And Paul has kept it all these years. He's still hanging on to it. He still has hopes of getting this thing back on the road someday. Now, some might say that if he hasn't done it already, then he's never going to get around to it. But I will say that between the first time I visited this car, which was back in the spring, and visiting it just a couple of weeks ago, he has made some progress on getting this car cleaned out, getting it closer to being able to put that floor pan in it and start making this thing drivable again. He's got an engine plan, he's got all sorts of ideas, and plenty of parts accumulated to put this car together. Now, whether or not he puts it back together as the Phantom, or if he just has it in primer, or whatever the case is, just knowing this car's history and knowing that it still survives and that it's in a good home, that means a lot to me, and that I'm sure that means a lot to you guys, because Everybody loves to see these cars live on and to see the legacy live on. And that's exactly what's happening here with this 55 Chevrolet. It's an iconic, old school, budget built race car from way back in the day, and it's still living on in Chattanooga, Tennessee.